Have you ever wondered why someone can disappear all day, act distant for weeks, and still think about you when no one is watching? Here's the uncomfortable truth. Avoidants often miss people in silence. The question isn't whether they think about you at night. The question is whether thinking about you is stronger than their need to protect themselves. One of the most misunderstood truths about human behavior is that missing someone and reaching out to them are not the same thing. Most people assume that if a person truly cares, they will call, text, or find a way back into your life. But psychology is often far more complicated than that. There are people who spend hours thinking about someone they never contact. People who replay memories, revisit old conversations in their mind, and wonder how someone's life is unfolding, all while remaining completely silent. This seems irrational until you understand what is really happening beneath the surface. For many emotionally guarded individuals, memories feel safer than reality. A memory cannot reject them. A memory cannot create expectations. A memory cannot demand vulnerability. It exists in a controlled environment where they can experience connection without risking exposure. This is why the quiet hours of the night can become so powerful. During the day, distractions protect people from their emotions. Work, responsibilities, entertainment, and routines keep uncomfortable feelings buried. But when everything becomes still, the mind often returns to what it has been avoiding. A certain laugh, a specific conversation, a moment that felt meaningful. Suddenly, someone they have not spoken to in months feels present again. Yet instead of reaching out, they stay where they feel safest. In reflection, the uncomfortable truth is that many people would rather revisit a connection than risk changing it. They would rather imagine what could happen than face what might happen. This is why silence should never automatically be interpreted as absence of feeling. Sometimes it reflects fear, pride, uncertainty, or emotional self-protection. But there is another truth most people need to hear. Memories are not actions. Thoughts are not commitment. Nostalgia is not effort. A person can think about you every night and still choose not to show up in your life. And that is why the strongest people learn to stop measuring their value by who remembers them, and start measuring it by who is willing to reach for them when remembering is no longer enough. One of the most hidden aspects of human behavior is that people rarely experience their own actions the way others experience them. When someone creates distance, pulls away, or becomes emotionally unavailable, they often don't sit there thinking, "I'm hurting this person." Instead, the human mind instinctively searches for explanations that make its behavior feel reasonable. This is how psychological self-protection works. People create stories that help them avoid emotional discomfort. They tell themselves they need space, that the timing is wrong, that they're too busy, that the relationship wasn't right, or that focusing on themselves is the responsible choice. Sometimes those reasons contain truth, but what most people never realize is that these explanations can also become shields that protect someone from confronting deeper emotions they don't want to face. The fascinating part is that a person can genuinely miss you while simultaneously convincing themselves that distance is the right decision. This creates an internal conflict that remains invisible to everyone else. On the outside, they appear calm, certain, and unaffected. On the inside, they are constantly reinforcing a narrative that justifies staying away. Watch real life closely and you'll see it happen everywhere. Someone avoids a difficult conversation and calls it protecting their peace. Someone withdraws from a meaningful connection and labels it independence. Someone fears vulnerability and convinces themselves they simply haven't found the right person. The mind is incredibly skilled at turning emotional avoidance into logical reasoning. This is why trying to argue someone out of their distance rarely works. You are not fighting their behavior, you are fighting the story they have built around that behavior. And people defend their stories because those stories protect them from uncertainty, guilt, and fear. The uncomfortable truth is that many people would rather preserve a comforting explanation than confront a painful reality about themselves. That is why distance often has less to do with what someone feels, and more to do with what they are willing to admit. And sometimes the strongest thing you can understand is this: a person's excuses are often not evidence of what is true. They are evidence of what they need to believe in order to live with their own choices. One of the most uncomfortable truths about human behavior is that curiosity often survives long after communication ends. Most people assume that if someone is not reaching out, they must not be thinking about them. But human psychology is rarely that simple. There are people who quietly monitor the lives of others without ever announcing their presence. They check for signs, notice changes, observe patterns, and gather information from a distance while remaining completely silent. Not because they don't care, but because observation feels safer than engagement. Engagement requires vulnerability. Observation requires nothing. This is why someone can know more about your life than you realize, while making no effort to be part of it. They may notice your absence from social media, wonder who you're spending time with, or feel a sudden reaction when they see evidence that you're moving forward. Yet they never send the message. They never make the call. They remain hidden behind the safety of distance. The fascinating part is that many people mistake curiosity for commitment. They assume that if someone is watching, they must be preparing to return. But curiosity and action are completely different psychological processes. Curiosity satisfies the need to know. Action requires the courage to risk. This is where people become trapped. They start performing their lives for an invisible audience, hoping that the right photo, the right achievement, or the right display of happiness will finally trigger a response. But the moment you start living for someone's attention, you surrender control of your own emotional state. The real power comes when you stop wondering who is watching and start paying attention to who is participating, because behavior reveals priorities. Anyone can observe from a distance. Anyone can keep tabs without taking responsibility. What separates genuine interest from passive curiosity is willingness to step forward. The hidden truth is that some people want access to your life without the vulnerability of being part of it. And the moment you understand that, you stop being impressed by silent attention and start valuing visible effort. Because at the end of the day, the people who truly value you don't just look for signs of your life, they find a way to become part of it. One of the deepest truths about human connection is that people often do not miss a person in the lich. They miss the experience of being around that person. This is a distinction most people never learn to make. When someone leaves your life, what remains is not just their face, their words, or the memories you shared. What lingers is the emotional atmosphere they created, the way they made ordinary moments feel different, the sense of comfort, excitement, certainty, understanding, or even challenge that existed whenever they were present. Human beings become accustomed to emotional patterns, and when those patterns disappear, an absence is created that can be difficult to explain. This is why someone may suddenly think about you long after communication has stopped. Not necessarily because they consciously decided to reconnect, but because they notice something missing. The conversation feels flatter, the days feel quieter. The emotional experience they once took for granted is no longer available. What makes this so fascinating is that many emotionally guarded people do not immediately recognize what they are feeling. They notice the absence before they identify the source. They feel the empty space before they acknowledge who created it. This is why distance can sometimes increase awareness. When your presence is constant, people adapt to it. When it disappears, they finally experience the contrast. Think about the people who only realize the value of a friendship, relationship, or connection after it is gone. They are not discovering something new. They are becoming conscious of something they stopped noticing. The uncomfortable truth is that your energy leaves an imprint on people whether they admit it or not. But there is an even more important truth. Feeling the absence of your energy is not the same as earning access to it again. Because true connection is not measured by who misses your presence when it's gone. It is measured by who values it enough to show up before they lose it. One of the most misunderstood truths about human behavior is that even people who create distance often want to know whether they still matter. Most people assume that if someone chose to leave, became emotionally unavailable, or stopped investing in the connection, they no longer care what happens next. But human psychology is far more complex than that. The desire for freedom and the desire for significance can exist in the same person at the same time, and someone may resist closeness, avoid vulnerability, or walk away from a relationship, yet still quietly wonder whether they occupy a place in your mind. Not necessarily because they want to return, but because human beings are deeply influenced by the need to feel meaningful in the lives they touch. This is why some people become unexpectedly curious when they sense your attention fading. As long as they believe you are emotionally available, there is nothing new to discover. Your feelings feel certain. Your presence feels guaranteed. But the moment your energy shifts, the moment you stop reaching out, stop explaining, and stop revolving your life around them, uncertainty enters the picture. And uncertainty is psychologically powerful. Suddenly, questions begin to surface. Have they moved on? Do they still think about me? Am I becoming part of their past? What makes this uncomfortable is that many people spend years trying to convince someone of their value, when value often becomes most visible in absence. When your attention is constantly available, it can become background noise. When it is withdrawn, its significance becomes impossible to ignore. But there is an important lesson hidden inside this dynamic. Someone wondering about you is not the same as someone choosing you. Curiosity is not commitment. Concern is not investment. The strongest people understand that their goal is not to remain unforgettable in someone's mind. Their goal is to build a life so meaningful that they no longer need proof they are being remembered. Because the moment you stop measuring your worth by who misses you, you become impossible to control. And the greatest shock to someone who expected your attention forever is discovering that your life continued beautifully without it. One of the most important truths about human behavior is that feelings and actions are not the same thing. Most people assume that if someone feels enough, they will act. If they miss you, they'll call. If they care, they'll show up. If they love you, they'll fight for the connection. It sounds logical, but reality is often far more complicated. Human beings do not act based solely on what they feel. They act based on what they are emotionally capable of handling. This is where many people become trapped in confusion. They look at someone's distance and assume there must be no feelings there. Yet beneath the surface, that person may be experiencing affection, nostalgia, curiosity, regret, or even longing. The problem is that emotions alone do not create movement. Emotions must pass through fear, pride, insecurity, self-protection, and personal beliefs before they become action. And for some people, those barriers are stronger than the feelings themselves. Think about how often people know exactly what they should do, but still fail to do it. They know they should apologize, but they don't. They know they should have an honest conversation, but they avoid it. They know they should reach out, but they remain silent. The issue is rarely a lack of awareness. The issue is emotional resistance. What makes this dynamic so painful is that many people spend years trying to decode feelings when they should be observing behavior. They become obsessed with signs, hidden meanings, and emotional possibilities. But relationships are not built on possibilities. They are built on choices. A person may feel 100 different things about you in private, but those feelings only become meaningful when they influence how that person shows up in your life. This is the awakening most people resist because it forces them to let go of fantasy and face reality. The uncomfortable truth is that someone can genuinely care about you and still fail to choose you. And in the end, your future will never be determined by what someone feels in silence. It will be determined by what they are willing to do when those feelings demand courage. The biggest mistake people make is believing that being missed is the same as being chosen. Someone can think about you every night, wonder about you in silence, and replay memories when no one is watching. None of that changes your life unless it becomes action. Never build your future on someone's private feelings. Build it on their visible behavior. Because in the end, the most powerful question isn't whether they secretly miss you at night. It's whether they are brave enough to do something about it when morning comes.